Hi folks, welcome. This is Learn Hittite. I do hope everyone is having a fantastic day today. Let me give you a bit of an explanation what I'm up to and what we're going to be doing today. Basically, at the moment, I'm working on an ambitious video and it has ended up being a little bit more challenging than I expected it to be. Actually, like many of my videos, to be honest. I'm confident it's going to be a video that a lot of people will be interested in. The topic is really cool. It'll get a lot of clicks. A lot has actually been written about it over the years in the literature. It's speculative just by its very nature, and I want to treat it as fairly as possible. But trying to do all that and get it into a kind of like manageable 25 to 30 minute video format has been a little bit tricky. But I want to get the video done basically because I'm inspired by similar work that has been undertaken in academia concerning Uralic. I'm quite happy with a similar video that I did concerning the issue. I'm not going to spoil exactly what the topic is about, but basically I think you're going to love it. It's just taking me longer than I expected. Things are also complicated by the fact that the weather is awesome at the moment where I am. So yeah, I've been spending less time in front of a laptop and more time outside in the sun touching grass. But I am well aware that I need to appease the YouTube algorithm gods with semi-regular uploads. So I thought I would give you a low effort or lowish effort video today, which will be basically me answering the most frequent questions and the most interesting questions that have either been sent to me directly or that have been left in the comment section. YouTube lets you filter for comments with questions in, so I'll probably just cut and paste the comment and the question and put it on screen. What I will do is I'll hide the handle of the original poster because, you know, when they left a question, they maybe didn't think it would become the center point of a video sometime in the future. Maybe folks don't want to be the center of attention or whatever. I'll hide the handle. And also, if there's been several variations of the same question, or if it's just a really long-winded question, I'll paraphrase a version and put it on screen. I'll try and group the questions somewhat in terms of theme, but please be forewarned, I'm going to be giving on-the-fly answers today. If this isn't the type of video that you expect from me, no worries, absolutely no worries, no offense taken. Please leave a like anyways, leave a comment, maybe watch an advert or two, and rest assured, I think I've got something you're going to really love coming up next. Or possibly hate, who knows. But the point is it should be interesting. I just need a little bit of extra time to get it done. Anyway, without me dragging out this introduction any longer, first question is going to be concerning the Kalasmaic language, the recently discovered Kalasmaic language. I've done a video about it before. So question one, I think they found more tablets written in this language right. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with this, Kalasma language, sometimes called Kalasmaic or Kalasmian, was announced in 2023 after researchers identified previously unknown linguistic material in the Hittite archives. Reasonably quickly after it was discovered, we got a presentation on the Aegean Studies group. So what we know is that the language is Anatolian, the Anatolian branch of Indo-European, to be clear. It appears to be related to the Luvic languages, but every author that's written on it stresses that it's not simply Luvian. I think in my video I placed it closest to Palaic. I can't remember exactly. However, it doesn't matter. The point is that the evidence that we have, or the material that we have on Kalasma is very limited. And as far as I'm aware, and unless the person who asked this question has got some inside knowledge from the archaeological team, as far as I'm aware, the Kalasma language survives in a single Hittite ritual text. Kalasma as a language was referenced elsewhere before, but we only have one text. What we have is a Hittite tablet describing a ritual associated with the region of Kalasma, and within that text is a short-ish incantation in the Kalasma language itself. Now, as far as I'm aware, no additional Kalasmaic material has been identified yet, but I think I know where the author might have got this idea that more tablets, that more material has been discovered. And that's because the find, which included the Kalasma text, was part of a bigger find that included, I think, well over 100 tablets. But as far as I'm aware, only one tablet with Kalasma material has been identified. Could more be identified in the future? Absolutely. But I think at the moment we only have one. And unless it was a really long text, it probably wouldn't tell us more than we already know. But because Hittite scribes were very thorough in recording rituals and religious practices, because of this, we get preserved examples of Hattic, Palaic, and now Kalasmaic. And I think the fact that Hittite scribes recorded elements of rituals, containing foreign languages, speeches, texts, incantations, may suggest that the scribes believed, or those in power believed, that these rituals, or perhaps the gods associated with them, were best approached in their original linguistic and cultural context, which I think is pretty cool. Now, this leads us on to the second question. How is the Hittite going? And I think this question is in relation to the fact that the channel is called Learn Hittite, and the channel started by producing a series of videos to help people to learn Hittite. So I get a lot of questions from people asking me when I'm going to restart making those videos. And the answer is that, honestly, I don't know. I'm not particularly happy with the videos that I made on Hittite or on learning Hittite for a variety of reasons, but primarily because they were the first ever videos that I made. And, they look like the first videos somebody's made, right? They're not to a great standard. I would do things better and differently this time. But so I would at least like to remake those videos. I've kept those videos that I did make up because I can see that people do use them. And I appreciate that. They always get tens of views each month, and people comment and things like this. And also, when I started making these videos, I went with the strategy of aiming the videos at folks with basically no background in linguistics or language learning. And I'm not sure that was the right idea. I might do it differently next time, because I think most of my audience are at least somewhat familiar with basic concepts like grammatical case and stuff like that. So perhaps I would pace the videos differently if I remade them. I don't know, but that's first on the list. And I also wanted to make these videos back in the day because I wanted to show that learning Hittite can be immensely rewarding for many different reasons. But in contrast to learning a modern oral language, you don't have to worry about speaking to anybody, right? It's highly unlikely you're going to have to interact with somebody in Hittite in 2026. And I think that is great for introverts like myself. So it's definitely on my plan of things to do, making more videos, but it is fairly low down on the list at the moment. Those videos were popular, but they don't compare to like the popularity of my videos on proto-languages. So yeah. And this brings us nicely to the third question, where a few folks have commented that I should change the channel name because it's misleading. So yeah, I don't know about that. I do understand the point. I made the decision on the channel name years ago now, before I had any idea how my content would develop and things like that. My goal was just to get 1,000 views. I remember at the time, just 1,000 views, not 1,000 subscribers, just 1,000 views. So I understand that the channel name is misleading, but I consider it still an instruction, right? Learn Hittite. People should learn Hittite. You've got my videos that I've made, regardless of the standard of them. And my advice is always pick up a copy of the Elements of Hittite. The book should be behind my shoulder somewhere. It's an excellent book, and it will get you started in learning to be able to read Hittite. So to be fair, I do have content on learning Hittite still on my channel. I thought about dropping the learn bit and just having like L Hittite or Mr. Hittite or something like that. I don't know. I also, I don't want to dramatically change the name, because honestly I've got attached to it, and I think other people know me as Learn Hittite now. So as always, I would leave it to the viewers. Let me know what you think, and if you've got a cool channel name, please drop it in the comments if you don't mind me appropriating it. Yeah, maybe we can take it forward from there. But if you think I should stick with Learn Hittite, let me know that as well. Because honestly, there's a lot of channels out there where the channel name doesn't really reflect the channel's content, right? So yeah. But back to questions concerning linguistics. Question number 4, and I've had a few similar ones, but they're all basically asking why IPA forms aren't used in modern linguistic papers, or aren't exclusively used in modern linguistic papers. And we've got this example from the question on screen. So this is a really good question. The International Phonetic Alphabet has been around since the late 19th century as a way of standardizing the written representation of the sounds of speech. So you would imagine that this would be useful for linguists, and it is. But the thing to remember is it isn't the only phonetic alphabet out there. And that is something I think people often overlook. Now, I'll say that when I make my videos, I use whatever standard is used in the particular field that I'm covering. Because if people go away having watched one of my videos and they want to check the source material, I want my videos to be an accurate reflection of what they will find in the source material. Because I can imagine in a different reality, let's say one where I used IPA exclusively in my videos, I can imagine one of the questions I would get when making a video like this would be, why don't your phonological inventories match up with what's in the sources that you cite? Because, not everyone is familiar with things like IPA or the fact that different notation systems exist. But I absolutely get the point. So why isn't it exclusively used in academia? One standardized form? Well, what I would say is that it is moving that way. If you take the Oxford Guide to the Uralic languages, for example, they actually state that they took the painful decision to move away from the traditional Finno-Ugric transcription method to IPA, where possible. However, they retained traditional notation for proto-language reconstructions. The reasoning is quite interesting. IPA symbols can sometimes imply a degree of phonetic precision that simply isn't available when we're dealing with reconstructed forms. We have to remember that proto-language reconstructions are models. They're not recordings, they're not direct observations, they are predictions about what the ancestral language may have looked like. And actually, for me, this highlights something important. Transcription and reconstruction are not the same thing. Yes, a system such as Finno-Ugric transcription can be used to transcribe an attested language, but it can also be, and it is used to represent a reconstruction. This often causes confusion because the same symbols are doing slightly different jobs. IPA can certainly be used for reconstructions as well, but many historical linguists prefer more traditional systems because they avoid suggesting a level of certainty that simply isn't there. And this is one reason why people sometimes struggle when they encounter Proto-Indo-European reconstructions, because it differs from the strict IPA that perhaps people are familiar with. Later, there's a section in the book where they actually explain why all of these different transcription standards exist. And it's mainly because the earliest work on the languages in question, so the Uralic languages, predate the establishment of standardized phonetic alphabets. And also for things like the Caucasian languages, or the northwestern Caucasian languages, I think, IPA isn't great. It becomes really clumsy really quickly if you use IPA to represent these languages. Why? Because of the eye-wateringly large consonant inventories, right? And also there's a question of whether IPA can actually catch all of the nuance which is specific to this region in general. I think it actually can, but there is this counter argument. So yeah, if I had to sum it up, a lot of this comes down to tradition. People tend to continue doing things the way that they've always been done. If you've spent decades reading, writing, teaching, publishing in one notation system, switching to another isn't always attractive. And the authors of the Oxford volume basically acknowledge this themselves. At the end of the day, all of these notation systems are trying to achieve broadly the same goal, although some are more convenient than others depending on the language family and the research tradition involved. That said, IPA is definitely becoming more common, and I think that that's generally a good thing when we're dealing with strictly the transcription of attested spoken languages. Proto-language reconstruction, though, is something different. Personally, I quite like the stance taken by the Oxford Guide to the Uralic Languages, because it serves as a useful reminder that reconstructed sounds are models rather than, a precise phonological reality. And honestly, once you've spent a bit of time with them, these different systems, they aren't nearly as intimidating as they first appear. Americanist notation, Finno-Ugric transcription, traditional Indo-European conventions, IPA, they're all ultimately trying to represent human speech in some form. The symbols may differ, but the underlying idea is much the same. What I would say is that it's always a good habit to read the introductory material, or the kind of like the front matter at the beginning of any language book, because usually it's here where they explain why certain choices were made, regarding not only transcription and glossing, but also why certain terms are used and things like this, because different authors, different publishers, Uralic studies, Dravidian studies, Indo-European, they all have their little idiosyncrasies and specificities, and it's useful to know about them before we take a deep dive into the work. Question number 5. What happened to the Uralic in Ural-Altaic? So I think this is reference to the fact that often Uralic is removed from the Altaic discussion nowadays. And what I would say, at a really macroscopic level, for many long-range researchers, the affinity between Uralic and Altaic is still very much alive and well. Although, admittedly, there's perhaps been not much been published on the issue since the early 2000s. And we also have to remember that oftentimes Ural-Altaic gets covered when we're talking about things like Eurasiatic and Nostratic. If we're talking about just Ural-Altaic as a genetic node by itself, most Altaicists, Trans-Eurasianists and others have basically disregarded the theory. In things like the Etymological Dictionary of the Altaic Languages, that's pretty much the position put forward there, if I remember correctly, and that was published in 2003 by a group of authors who are perhaps a little bit known for not being afraid to lump things together where they can. However, the main reason Ural-Altaic began to fall out of favour is that researchers struggled to identify a consistent body of lexical correspondences across all of its proposed branches. Many proposed cognates were either restricted to only some groups or appeared better explained through things like a real contact, borrowing, substrate influence, rather than descent from a common ancestor. Take all this combined with the growing recognition in the field that structural similarities can often arise through prolonged language contact and a real influence. All this led to a major decline in the enthusiasm for the Ural-Altaic hypothesis. That being said, there are still works being published that consider Ural-Altaic. I've got one here in front of me. I think this is from 2011 on some suffixes, actually a nominalizing suffix shared between Turkic, Mongolic, and it perhaps has parallels across the Ural-Altaic zone. And that's something I'd like to highlight. Ural-Altaic is definitely still a thing if you're talking about a linguistic convergence zone. And for me, the nominalizer in this book appears to be part of that convergence zone. There's many weird and wonderful shared similarities and features between the languages of Uralic and the so-called Altaic language families, as this book points out. You can definitely see why researchers back in the day suspected a genetic relationship. And who knows, as our research and understanding regarding the really deep history of the proto-languages in question improves, maybe some connection between Uralic and one or perhaps some of the so-called Altaic Trans-Eurasian languages will be somewhat demonstrated. Next question number 6, I think, if I've been counting them correctly. Do you believe in the existence of the Penutian language family? Penutian, I think I'm saying that. So I don't know a lot about this proposal. I do know that Penutian is a proposed language family in kind of like Western North America, and its original centre point was California, although the proposal expanded considerably over time. The chunkiest version is called Macro-Penutian, and that even includes the Mayan languages. The name itself is a compound of pen and uti, both meaning two in different branches of the proposed family, although please feel free to correct me there if I'm wrong. The idea has been around since the early 1910s, but it's pretty much been controversial from the beginning. A lot of the earlier work has been criticised on methodological grounds, even by people at the time, and many linguists today would argue that the proposed cognate sets are just not robust enough to demonstrate a genetic relationship. There are some similarities in pronominal systems of certain languages involved, but similarities of this kind are generally not considered sufficient on their own to establish a language family, right? Especially that nowadays we know pronominal systems can be subject to borrowing and a real influence, just like everything else. Basically, the story of Penutian follows that of many large-scale language family proposals from the early 20th century. A number of languages were grouped together on the basis of similarities that many modern historical linguists would regard as insufficient evidence for a genetic relationship. Other than that, I don't know a huge amount about the proposal, so I'm reluctant to talk much more on it, but I know that it exists because Lyle Campbell lists it among his undemonstrated language family proposals. So if you're asking me whether I believe in the existence of Penutian as a demonstrated language family today, I would simply defer you to Campbell's assessment and say that the proposal remains unproven. That said, Some of the smaller subgroupings that have historically been placed within Penutian look considerably more promising and hopefully will continue to be investigated. So it's still an interesting area of research if you're looking to get into that. Either way, if you want more detail on the history of the proposal and all of the arguments surrounding it, do check out Campbell's American Indian Languages. It's a fine book indeed. Question 7, another good question. This is about Burushaski, the language isolate of Pakistan, and the viewer is questioning why does it appear to have a Slavic suffix, ski, I guess, ashki. So it is interesting, right, this ending. And if we remember my video on Burushaski, it was all about whether there was any real justification behind attempts to link the language with Indo-European. And this suffix is actually one of the correspondences discussed in the literature that supports an Indo-European connection. Chasule, for example, writes about it. So it's absolutely legitimate that the person asking the question is curious about it. It doesn't just occur in the term Burushaski either. There's at least one other term that I can remember. It would be the Burushaski equivalent of own language that has this ski ending. It does appear in a few different forms, in a few different contexts. If we were to look at Hermann Berger's work on Burushaski, I believe the suffix is glossed as having the meaning something like own, belonging to, in the style of, in the language of. Now, coming back to the original question, why does it have a Slavic looking suffix? Well, one possibility might be that it was borrowed into Burushaski at some point in the past. The prehistory of Burushaski remains unclear and its homeland is far from certain. Some authors have suggested that the ancestors of the Burushaski speakers may have arrived in the region doing or with the same broad migrations that brought Indo-European languages into South Asia. So ancient contact with Indo-European languages cannot be ruled out. It is worth noting that Chasule, the principal advocate of a Burushaski Indo-European relationship, has identified a number of features and correspondences which he compares specifically with the Slavic languages. However, interestingly, this particular suffix isn't mentioned in the literature as being one of those borrowed from Slavic. In the literature, though, supporting the argument, the controversial argument, that Burushaski is a somewhat distant, divergent form of Indo-European, these works simply treat the suffix as a straight inheritance from either pre- or Proto-Indo-European. In any case, whether it's a Slavic loan, some other Indo-European loan, or an inherited term, it doesn't really matter. All such proposals are controversial in the literature, and there are many equally good or equally poor arguments, depending on how you look at it, in the literature, linking Burushaski historically and genetically to things as diverse as Dene Caucasian, Yeniseian, Dravidian, and so on. I'd also like to point out that from the Indo-European side of the argument, even researchers who support an Indo-European connection can't agree on where and how Burushaski is connected. This obviously complicates things, and combine that with the fact that we don't have much time depth in Burushaski data, it complicates the issue even further. So most Burushaski researchers, at least as far as I can tell, simply treat the suffix as a native Burushaski one. There are several variant forms attested and some discussion in the literature about whether we're actually dealing with a single suffix or perhaps a compound of older suffixes. I'm not entirely convinced it's a compound form, but nevertheless the arguments are still there. So the short answer is that the suffix resembles forms found in Slavic languages. Yes, that's clear, but the resemblance alone doesn't really tell us where it came from. It could just be a chance resemblance. Its ultimate origin remains uncertain, and different explanations have been proposed depending on really how one interprets the broader question of Burushaski's history and external relationships. For the moment, however, I personally favour considering this suffix as a native Burushaski one. Question number 8. What do you think of the Uralo-Yukaghir theory? And I'm going to try and answer 2 questions in one, because I also remember there was a similar question asking my thoughts on Uralo-Siberian. Uralo-Siberian being an expanded family over Uralo-Yukaghir, including the Escalute languages. Yukaghir is found in the Russian Far East. There's 2 surviving languages, but with very small numbers of speakers. So I would say that many Uralicists see the similarities between, for example, Uralic and Yukaghir as the result of contact, specifically the contact between Samoyedic and Yukaghir. This is the position held by Luobol Samasama Ante, and I would always encourage people to generally default to whatever opinion this scholar has regarding anything Uralic, because this person is the person that knows the Uralic languages most intimately at their deepest levels. I do know that other Uralicists like Blazek and his colleague, I forget the name though, unfortunately at the moment, but I'll put it on screen, tried to revisit Uralic Yukaghir connections in a 2024 work. That's relatively recent. I've never actually read that work, but I have read the reviews, and the reviews considered it just another piece of long-range work suffering from typical long-range problems. I think one reviewer pointed out that there was a big focus on shared vocabulary, but no real deeper analysis, which of course is problematic. I am a fan of Michael Fortescue's work on Uralo-Siberian, but I can only say I'm a fan of it from the surface level. I took a look at Fortescue's work whilst preparing my video on Yeniseian, but I never took a deep dive. However, I, to this day, remember that some of the grammatical correspondences looked really convincing to me, and I always like a good grammatical correspondence. I think generally over all of the data that I saw presented in Fortescue's 2022 work, it looked pretty decent. But again, I didn't check it personally, check the ins and outs. I didn't do the deep dive, and you always have to do the deep dive before you judge any type of proposal like that, because you need to see, are they using the source material that they use to come up with these conclusions well? What source material they're using, how they're interpreting it, things like that. I do know that there are some reviewers that have questioned the validity concerning parts of the Uralic data. So that's problematic. But you know, on the other hand, generally, overall, the reviews of Fortescue's work have been fairly positive. I think anyone that is arguing for Uralo-Yukaghir or Uralo-Siberian should first adequately address the criticisms of Uralicists, right? Because they're the experts on Uralic languages, and we need to respect their opinion. If they're suggesting that these similarities and these correspondences are due to a real contact, then it needs to be addressed, and we need to demonstrate why we think that they're due to a genetic origin. If you don't do that, if researchers don't do that, there's always going to be this cloud hanging over the argument. And I do remember that in Fortescue's half book on the issue, and it is a half book because the second half of the book focuses on something else, he acknowledges the criticisms from Uralicists but doesn't really do anything with it. Maybe Uralic is the issue, you know, if Uralicists are providing most of the issues with Uralo-Siberian, maybe first a good idea would be focusing on connections between Yukaghir and Esgalut, right, and kind of bypassing Uralic. I don't know, but it does seem to be Uralicists that are causing the biggest problems or are the biggest voices against Uralo-Yukaghir, Uralo-Siberian. Jan Hunnen has recently published an article on the issue. I haven't read it, but I would definitely be interested to see what he had to say. Summing up, I do like a lot of the work that I've seen, and I don't think it suffers from the full repertoire of issues that other long-range proposals often suffer from, you know, despite what a minority of reviewers might say. I would definitely be interested in taking a proper deep dive into both of the proposals, Uralo-Yukaghir, Uralo-Siberian, and just, you know, seeing the kind of fundamentals, the fundamental data that the proposals are based on. But I'm also interested in what future work will bring, because Lualbo is in my opinion, the leading Uralicist at the moment, but there are several others following behind him. But Fortescue is the leading researcher when it comes to Proto-Esgalut, right? So clearly he knows what he's talking about from that side of the argument. The big issue is just reconciling it with the objections from Uralicists. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. Now, this question is about Tungusic, Proto-Tungusic, and the person asking the question wants to know why is the ablative proto-suffix one way when in two modern languages it has a different form? Wouldn't it make sense for the reconstruction to reflect the forms in the modern languages? Great question. I love it. And I can answer it quite well, I think. When I did my video on Proto-Tungusic, at the part where I showed the Proto-Tungusic case system, I gave two languages an example of the full repertoire of cases in some modern Tungusic languages, because the number can get quite high, number of cases can get quite high. I only used two because trying to get all of the Tungusic varieties on screen would have just looked really messy and in fact be really difficult to read. So I just chose two, and they just happened to share the same ablative form. However, across the Tungusic languages as a whole, the ablative is not identical. There is some variance, and some languages don't even have an ablative case. The reason the proto-level reconstruction is different than what is presented from the variants on screen is because for a long time now, scholars have generally agreed, in fact I can say it's probably universally accepted, that many local cases in the Tungusic daughter languages, so local cases would mean expressing spatial or temporal relations, well, these local cases are actually compounds built out of earlier, more primitive spatial markers. So the form you saw in the two daughter languages is itself a compound rather than the original primitive suffix. It's probably a compound. Now, I can't remember the exact forms, but I'll put the forms on screen now. Now, exactly what the local case inventory looked like at the Proto-Tungusic stage is debated, and it almost certainly changed through time. Early Proto-Tungusic, or we could say pre-Proto-Tungusic, likely had its grammatical cases and at least some local cases, though exactly how many existed at the proto stage is unclear. Jan Hunnen has just two. I would put three. Other researchers like Ostolskaya have like 7 or 8, I think. But then later on, we get this process whereby these complex case markers are developing through combinations of these various spatial suffixes. The next question is related, again on Tungusic. What do you think can be done to preserve endangered languages like Tungusic? Fieldwork, fieldwork, fieldwork. Documentation is the most important, documenting as much as we can of endangered languages before it's too late should be the priority for anybody interested in preserving endangered languages. To do this, can we say professionally, requires funding, of course, unfortunately. But what I would say is that if you live in a part of a world where there is an endangered language nearby, and I know some of my viewers do, go and do the field work. Do it yourself. You can get yourself a copy of Crowley's book, Field Linguistics, A Beginner's Guide. It's the best book out there, in my opinion, concerning field work and how to get started in it. Oxford also have another book, a similar type of book, but Crowley's is the best, trust me. It will teach you how to become a dirty feet linguist instead of an armchair one. And any kind of revitalisation programme in the future can only exist if we've adequately documented the endangered language in question. And there are many endangered languages out there and not enough documentation. Right, final question, folks. A Finn here, fascinating video, no problem, brother. As an aside, one small thing that catches my Finnic ear is the thing that many British English speakers put K after G in the pronunciation, as in speaking. It's baffling to my ear. You do it all the time. Is it a dialect thing? Well, I was born in Sutton Coldfield, so North Birmingham. I grew up in South Staffordshire around Cannock. I've lived most of my adult life abroad. I do not know if any element of the way that I speak is from my dialect as a child, or just the weird version that it's evolved into through many years of living abroad and things like this. So honestly, I have no idea. I'm not particularly knowledgeable on dialects of English either. However, I can suggest where you might be able to find a definitive answer. Get yourself a copy of Handbook of Varieties of English. I forget who publishes it. It's about 20 years old now. It's 2 volumes. The first volume is phonology and the second volume is like structure and morphology. And I think originally it came with a CD-ROM as well, with samples on that you could listen to. It's very, very thorough, but particularly useful in the first volume on phonology is the summary section at the end, or the summaries at the end. I do remember that as being particularly useful. I used this book when I prepared my video on Jamaican patois, and also when I prepared a video on Creoles that hasn't yet been published. Strangely, I think there is some university that is hosting both versions online for free. I don't know why. So they are easy to access and get your hands on them. Go and check them out. And yeah, that's like the easiest way to become knowledgeable on English dialects if you're interested in that sort of thing. Okay, folks, that's going to be all from me for today. I'm actually recording this outro a little while later because, man, it was hot when I was filming that video and I was starting to struggle a bit towards the end. I do hope you enjoyed this foray into a slightly different type of content. Feel free to drop any questions you have in the comment section, because you never know, they may end up in a video just like this one someday. Stay tuned because the next video should be dropping shortly and I think you might like it. Like, subscribe, buy me a coffee if you fancy it, and as always, you've been fantastic. Goodbye for now.